Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to another Faith-Seeking Understanding. I am your host, Allan. I am a pastor, retired, a professor. I am a Bible moth, a theologian in exile, and a peddler of hope. And I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith-Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated institution of higher learning, but a place where all persons are invited to ponder profound things free of charge. I am so excited to have today in conversation with me is Reverend Professor David Wilkinson, who is the professor and principal of St. John's College in the Department of Theology and Religion, University of Durham, United Kingdom. He is a Methodist minister. David, how are you today?
Well, I'm very well, Allan, and nice to be with a peddler of hope.
A peddler of hope. We need hope. Yeah.
I like that.
And you do offer hope, and what you're right. I really appreciate that. Now, I do have to ask you, the two things you and I have in common is we're both Methodists, but we also did our doctorates there at Durham, where you are now.
Yes.
You know, I did one Ph.D. and it just about did me in. And you have two.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
and one is in astronomy or physics.
Yes, astrophysics.
Astrophysics, and then the other one in theology. So
Yes.
I was thinking about this and thinking, you know, nobody at the age of 15 says, I think I'm going to do two PhDs, right? So could you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Yes, I didn't think at the age of 15 I'd ever do, never mind one PhD, but two. I was first a scientist. I came to Durham University at the age of 18 to do physics as a subject, and I'd just become a Christian at the age of 17. And what I found, looking back on it, was that my science and my faith grew together. That was interesting for me. I found science at university far more interesting than at school or college. You dealt with things like relativity or quantum theory, some of the really cool physics. That fascinated me. But there was also a sense in which I think, looking back on it, my Christian faith was introducing me to a sense of, I was studying the works of the Creator through science, that science was a gift. And because of what God had created, it came to be even of more value to me as a scientist. I felt a call to Christian leadership. And so after doing some work at doctoral level in the origin of the universe and star formation and galaxies, I felt that God was calling me to lead churches. I went away, did some theology, led a church in inner city Liverpool for a decade or so. And then in a rather chaotic way, found that Durham, my old university, was calling me back, this time to do some teaching in theology. And it just seemed to me that there was an opportunity to do a second doctorate. As a member of staff in those days, Allan, it was cheap to do a second doctorate. You didn't have to pay the fees. That's very important. But more importantly, some of the thinking that I'd been doing allowed me just to, the structure of a PhD allowed me to start writing that down and thinking about it in a more systematic way. And so I ended up with two doctorates from the same university, Durham. I think the claim to fame was a local radio station who devoted an afternoon to callers calling in and telling doctor jokes in my honor. I think that was the high point of my academic and media career as a result of that. I think that's the only great thing about doing two doctorates.
That looks good on a resume, doesn't it? Yeah. I like that. Okay, very good. All right. So you have written in the area of Christian faith, theology, science, and raising the questions of science and theology together. Our particular conversation today is on the question of Christian faith and extraterrestrial intelligence. You wrote a book about a decade ago entitled Science, Religion, and the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This has been a subject that has fascinated me for a while because there are certainly big theological implications. One of the things that I learned from you was I tended to think, as I think a lot of people do, is that in the history of theological reflection, Christian theologians really haven't dealt with this issue much, but that's not true. There is a long history of theologians thinking about the implications of what if there is intelligent life out there somewhere in the universe. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and you're absolutely right, because it's part of that Christian history that is rarely talked about.
Yeah.
But the speculation about other worlds goes right back to the church fathers, those early church theologians who thought about such things. And a number of them were particularly taken with the theological conviction that if God was free to create, God could create whatever God wanted to create in the universe. And so we were special. We saw that because of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Human beings have a special relationship with God. But that didn't need to be exclusive. That didn't need to be unique. And we shouldn't impose our experience as human beings on what God could or could not do. And so this tradition of thinking about, well, maybe God has done different worlds, created different beings in different worlds, was an expression of this fundamental commitment to the sovereignty of God, the freedom of God in creation. Now, that for many years held the dominant view within Christian theology. When Thomas Aquinas came along, great theologian of the Christian church, Aquinas did many good things, but one of the things that was limiting was that he baptized Aristotle. He took Aristotle's Greek philosophy and he saw there a great structure for talking about Christian faith. But the thing that was imported into Christian faith at that point was the centrality of the earth. Remember, Aristotle's universe had the earth at the center and the whole universe on crystalline spheres revolving around us. And so that sense of the central importance of human beings became one of the difficulties for theologians in thinking about other worlds. And you hear it today. You hear people say, well, how can we be special if there are other intelligent beings in the universe? Does that somehow undermine our specialness? And so a beginning of a dialogue happened within Christian theology. The freedom of God to create, the special nature of human beings. But post-Aquinas, you got some of the early astronomers, people like Kepler, people like Christian Huygens, Richard Bentley, who through new telescopes were beginning to see just how vast the universe was. And the vastness of the universe started to encourage that sense that God could have created new worlds. And so within Christian theology, Alan, you're quite right, that this untold story of Christians speculating about other worlds and being the first to speculate about other worlds is really important.
Yeah, and one of the things too about your work, I appreciate you talk about in the book, curiosity, the importance of curiosity. And I sometimes have thought, my experience as a pastor too over the years has been that in a lot of church traditions, there are just some questions you don't ask or you're not supposed to ask, and maybe people are afraid that it will do damage to the faith. I see this with young people who have questions, but there's certain things that are out of bounds, and sometimes it seems to me that maybe a certain understanding of our faith squelches our curiosity. And yet I think God made us curious. I think God made us wanting to know and asking questions.
I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, if you go back to the biblical material is full of questions.
Yes.
It's about psalmists asking questions. Why, Lord? Why suffering and injustice? Psalm 8, when I look at the heavens, the moon and the stars which you created, what are human beings that you're mindful of them? What's the place of humanity in this vast cosmos? right through to the New Testament, where my favorite disciple is Thomas, sometimes called the doubter. In fact, I think Thomas is better known as the questioner. He's the one who overcomes the embarrassment of all of the other disciples by asking the obvious question that all the other disciples don't want to ask. And continually, particularly in John's gospel, Thomas asks questions. He articulates. When Jesus says, "And you know the way where I am going," all of the disciples probably nod as if they know. They have no idea. Thomas is the one who says, "Come on, Lord, we don't know the way where you're going. What are you talking about?" At that point, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." If Thomas hadn't asked the question, we wouldn't have that amazing statement from Jesus. And so, and when it comes to certain questions of science, I think you're spot on, that often people are a bit worried, by asking the question, as if other Christians will look at them and say, "Well, you're a bit odd." Or sometimes people are worried that by asking the question, the Christian faith might not have some response. Now, the Christian faith doesn't give us answers to everything, Allan, as you well know. And sometimes we just have to reply with, "I don't know." But in my experience, there's no need to be fearful of asking questions of God. God's big enough for us to express our questions, whether they're curiosity or whether they're questions of anger, of emotion. But by asking questions, we go deeper. In fact, science itself, lots of people think that science is about us having the right answers. But for most of my colleagues and the very great scientists who I've talked to over the years, they will say that in fact, science is about asking the right questions. It's not primarily about finding answers. It's about asking the right questions. And I think when we come to extraterrestrial intelligence and aliens, all of the factors that we've talked about are in play. There are some Christian folk who think, would I be viewed to be odd by asking this question within my congregation? But in fact, most of us have thought about whether we're alone in the universe. Some folk are fearful that this is a really difficult thing for Christian theologians to think about. But in fact, as we've said, Christian theologians have thought about it for many centuries. And I think, I don't know whether there are other intelligent life forms elsewhere in the universe, but I'm not afraid of what the consequences for Christian faith would be if we did find a message from little green women and little green men one day.
Yeah. I have to tell you this weekend, we had our children and grandchildren up. We live out in the country. We were sitting out back at night with a fire in the fire pit. And all of a sudden, my son-in-law noticed these lights going across the sky in 2 rows. I'd never seen anything like it. And we're like, okay, what is that? Couldn't figure out what that was. So we're walking and looking at it and trying to figure it out. And my other son-in-law did some Googling, and it was the Starlink satellites, right? Elon Musk. So I was a little disappointed. It was just an earthly explanation. I do want to get into that question. I do want to get into also the question of the implications for our faith, if indeed there are extraterrestrial intelligences out there. But let's talk first about the possibilities. So one of the questions I want to ask you and then move on. I don't want to spend much time on this, but I have to ask you because I know if I don't, I'll get emails that I didn't ask this question. What do you think of what's going on? Congress is having these UAP hearings, and there are supposedly eyewitnesses to stuff, and we've been visited. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I want to take it seriously, Allan. I mean, in fact, the previous book that I wrote on extraterrestrial intelligence was partly motivated by the interest that people have in unidentified flying objects, as they were called in those days, unidentified aerial phenomenon, they're now called, and by some of the claims that we'd been visited. I think, for me, I always want to take claims and evidence seriously. So I don't think you can simply dismiss this as a loony fringe. I think there are people with real convictions that they have seen or encountered that which is unidentified. And I think there are a number of things that are not easily explainable by some of the natural phenomena that we know of. I mean, 99% of these things that we see in the sky, like your Starlink satellites, have reasonable explanations. We know this. But there are a number of things that we still don't understand.
Yeah.
Where I'm a little more cautious is going from unidentified to immediately saying that that is an alien spacecraft. So I think we stay open, and particularly as a Christian, we stay open to the possibility that there are unusual things going on, that we don't know everything about everything. But we need to test the evidence carefully. And this might be in terms of people's experiences of seeing or what they claim to be flying saucers. And there's a lovely graph which shows that the number of identifications of flying saucers does correlate with the level of drunkenness within a particular population late at night. So, I mean, that's not to decry what people are claiming. It's just to say we need to be sensible about this. And then I think we need to ask some bigger questions. So, for instance, if you're traveling the 3 million light years that would take you to arrive from Andromeda to this Earth, would you really just appear in a dark forest late at night? I mean, I suspect you would go straight to the White House or somewhere like that. I mean, it's a very long journey and ask for a cup of tea. So there's lots of questions to ask of this area. And therefore, I don't want to write it off. I don't want to simply believe everything that's claimed. I want to sift and test the evidence, just as I would with any religious experience or any claim to be healed, or indeed some of the stories of the New Testament. I think we use those God-given gifts of our mind and sifting evidence to assess the evidence and weigh the evidence. I'm not convinced myself that there is enough evidence to say that we have encountered alien spacecraft or alien visitors. I think we need to be open always to that possibility, and therefore I think my friend, the Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb, is right in saying that professional science and government need to examine some of these claims seriously. But I don't think that for me at the moment, there's enough evidence for it.
Sure. Okay. One of the interesting things you say, because I want to get into the question of, I guess, the more abstract question of, what are the odds of extraterrestrial and intelligence? First, let's talk. Would you talk about the difference? Because, of course, if we found simple life, if we found bacteria on Titan, Jupiter's moon, one of their moons, or we found a form on Mars that was extinct, I mean, that obviously would be big news. But it sure is different. There's a difference between discovering bacteria and actually discovering life that is intelligent. Why is that one the big game changer?
It's a very important point, and often is missed in popular discussions of this. Sometimes I put it this way: it's a long way from an amoeba to an accountant. Mm-hmm. Or maybe not, depending on the accountant, I suppose.
Maybe a little shorter from an amoeba to a politician or somebody.
Oh,
like that.
Absolutely. Or a British scientist.
Or a pastor.
That's right. And life could be widespread in a very simple form. But there are two aspects to the question that you've asked. The first is that it's a reminder that the circumstances for simple life to develop into complex life have to be very careful. That is, you need a star that has a long lifetime. You need a planet with a certain type of atmosphere. You need a certain configuration, perhaps, of a solar system. A whole number of things that have to be there and stable for complex life to develop in the way that we've known that it develops on Earth. And that's purely a reminder of the science that there could be primitive life in lots of places around the universe, but that doesn't mean inevitably you're going to get intelligent life. The second really important question is that intelligent life gives us a much better chance of knowing that it's there. One of the problems is in the sense of discovery of other life. Now, we can explore the solar system, and we can do that on the moon or Mars, and we're currently in the early stages of that, looking for primitive life deep below the surface. But once we start to move out into the rest of the universe, that's a very long pilgrimage, Allan. That's a very long journey for us to go to places. It might be much easier for us to pick up signals, communication from other civilizations, because those signals travel at the speed of light. And we're never going to, at the moment, get close to traveling at the speed of light as human beings. So intelligent life gives us an opportunity for widening our search area for whether there's other life elsewhere in the universe. And I think theologically, lots of people also want to make this distinction. You see that the occurrence of life on one of the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, as you say, would be a fascinating scientific result. But theologically, does it add anything more than the fact that we live in a world which is full of extravagance, non-human creation, from wasps to elephants, from grass to amoebas? That's part for me of God's extravagant creation. But I think the question which we mentioned earlier, Rolf, what does it mean to be human? How much do we have to be unique to understand our own identity? Theologically is increased for some people if there is other intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. Now, I don't find that a difficulty, I have to say. For me, other intelligent life would also be part of God's extravagant freedom in creation. And I don't have to be unique to be loved. The core of what makes me special as a human being in the Christian understanding is that I am loved. I don't know whether you have family. I've got 2 children. Both of them are loved by me. They're different. And I could go on for quite some length about how different they are. But I love them both. I don't just have one that enables me to love. But both of them, I hope, feel loved, even though I love them both. So in that sense, you don't have to be unique in order to be special. And that's a very important distinction. And in one of our forefathers as a theologian, Nicholas of Cusa, Cusa made a very fundamental theological move where he said, the Christian understanding is that we're special not because of our place in the universe, but because of the gift of relationship. And that's very important. It's God's initiative in forming a relationship with us that makes us special, not that we're the center, the only intelligent beings in the universe.
Wow. So in some ways, some of the things that we were asking, you talked about Aquinas and Aristotle. So as you said, the problem was we were asking the wrong questions, or we could have asked better questions.
I think that's always true in theology, isn't it, Allan? I mean, I think theology is an academic subject, also something that we learn in local churches, which I think for me, again, is perhaps not about knowing all of the answers, but helping us to ask the right kind of questions.
Yeah.
And knowing what the resources are that help us in asking those questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I tell folks the older I get, the more the questions pile up, more than the answers.
I think that's right. And I think, in any sense, you see, if Christianity was only about a dogmatic theory of everything, a series of statements that you had to ascribe to, then you would be looking for answers all of the time. But Christianity is a relationship with a personal God.
Yeah.
Relationship is always about questions. That's how relationships grow. And that's not to decry the importance for me of, say, scripture, which for me is the central supreme authority of way God has spoken. But it is giving a sense that we journey with God in relationship, and that both faith involves questions.
Yes, it does. It does.
So you make an interesting observation in your book in which you say, you're talking about the question of extraterrestrial intelligence, and you say that astronomers and physicists tend to be more bullish on the idea that there is intelligent life out there somewhere, and evolutionary biologists tend to be more skeptical. Could you explain why that is?
I think that's probably because, as we all know, biologists are far more intelligent than mere physicists, such as myself. Physicists and astronomers are taken with big numbers. So we know that our Milky Way galaxy consists of 100 billion stars. It is one of 100 billion galaxies in the universe. If you multiply those two numbers together, you get the number of stars in the universe, and it's something like 10 followed by 22 zeros. If you then say, and this is something we've been learning about just in the last 2 decades, that a fair proportion of those stars will develop planetary systems. And some of those planetary systems will have an Earth-like planet. Well, even small percentages of that 10 followed by 22 zeros gives you a lot of potential Earth-like planets where life could develop. So physicists are taken with these big numbers. Biologists know the complexity and the diversity of the evolutionary process. As Paul Davis would probably say, there's something about the development of intelligent life which is about the Goldilocks enigma. Things have to be just right for intelligent life to develop. And so, noting the complexity of the process, biologists, in my experience, are much more cautious about saying, even if you've got lots of potential Earths, to see the development of intelligent life at every one of those locations, by the way, which is the belief that Star Trek develops, because in Star Trek, there's an intelligent species within 40 minutes, at least, of anywhere that the Starship Enterprise goes. But biologists are saying, just hold on a moment. There might be primitive life, but let's just be cautious about its development. And so I find myself being swayed by both of those arguments. But I think there's a very telling argument, which was developed by a physicist called Enrico Fermi. And this is an additional argument to what we've just talked about. And it's called Fermi's paradox. And Fermi said, if they existed, they would be here. Now, Fermi was a physicist who did a very simple calculation. He said, imagine a civilization on one star of the Milky Way. How long, he said, would it take for an intelligent civilization to colonize the whole of the galaxy, the 100 billion stars in our galaxy? And he did the calculation. Turned out that he wasn't too far off what we believe now, about 300 million years. That's a very long time.
Yeah.
But in fact, our galaxy's been around for 10 billion years. So Fermi argued that if life was widespread within our galaxy and it was intelligent life, we would have already seen it. We would have already encountered it in a really obvious way. And therefore for Fermi, and I think I take this as my own view, is that we probably are alone as intelligent life within our galaxy. There'll be lots of basic primitive life around, but as intelligent life, we're probably alone. But the Fermi paradox doesn't rule out the issue that there could be another galaxy with intelligent life in it. But the problem there, Allan, is one of communication. So imagine a civilization in Andromeda, one of our nearest neighbor galaxies, sending a message to us saying, hello, is there anyone there? That would take a few million years to reach us. If we then send a message back saying, oh, hello, we're here, who are you? That would take another few million years for the message to reach them. That's not a very interesting podcast, waiting for that kind of length of time. So there's a fundamental problem with communication in this. So you've got physics, you've got biology, and then you've got folk beginning to think about how do civilizations communicate with each other, which is a very important part of this discussion.
Yeah. What about the idea, Homo sapiens, it's about 100,000 years we've been here, haven't we? About 100,000 years. Does this rule out any possibility there's another civilization that's right where we are, in a sense, and therefore isn't able to communicate with us?
It's possible.
Yeah.
It's possible that there's civilizations that are much earlier in their development than us. But for the same argument, there's also possibilities that are much older civilizations, because the basic building blocks that are needed for biological evolution have been around quite a long time. We're reasonably late developers in the history of the galaxy.
Yeah. We are kind of the young kids on the block, aren't we?
We're the young kids on the block. I mean, you wouldn't think about looking at you and I at the moment, but we're the young kids on the block. And so, I mean, some of these are big speculative questions. And that's why I'm a great supporter of us doing scientific work to understand how life forms, of surveying the universe in terms of whether there are possible exoplanets a bit like the Earth, and James Webb Telescope is doing that at the moment, and indeed us looking for radio sources and other forms of communication that might give us a clue that there's other civilizations. Because remember we started with this question of Christian theologians speculated about other worlds because they said God was free to do what God wanted to do. Now, if that's the case, how do you find out what God has done? The only way to find out what God has done is not to sit down and work it out with human philosophy. It's to train your telescope to the heavens and look and see what God has done. So the theological conviction that God is free to create whatever God wants to create was part of the foundation of the scientific revolution that said observation was key to what science is all about. Christianity contributed in a large part to the development of modern science.
Yeah, that's not something that sometimes we tend to do. We tend to get our ideas of God, and then we want to squeeze our observations into that.
Yes,
you know, God is A, B, and C, and therefore because God is A, B, and C, 1, 2, and 3 in the universe has to be this. Whereas what you're saying is no. If we want to find out what God is up to in the universe, we need to look at it and observe.
Absolutely, and it's a very basic thing for science now, because that's how science is done. But at the time of the scientific revolution, that wasn't an obvious thing to think about, because a major part of Greek science, along with some of the observation, was that God should follow human logic. The Aristotelian universe was built on the conviction that the sphere was the most perfect geometric shape. And people argued, well, therefore God created the universe based on spheres, because we as humans think that's the most perfect shape. In fact, we know that the orbits of the planets are in fact ellipses, they're not spheres in that sense. And whether God has a sense of humor with all of that, or that God just does things which are unexpected, that's very important. And again, the God of the Bible is a faithful God. But God also does unusual things, sometimes breaks our human perceptions, our human expectations. That's the unnerving thing sometimes about God, as well as the most exciting thing, that God is at work in the world. A faithful God, but sometimes he does unusual things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go with what you said, that you tend to think we could be the only intelligent civilization in the Milky Way. Let's say for a minute, there's one or two, but it's clearly not the Star Trek universe. You know, they're teeming with Klingons and Romulans and other aliens with different shades of color. That is just not the case. That if the Enterprise went out,
I think it's most unlikely.
yeah. So that raises the question. Then you talked about God has the freedom to create whatever God wants. John Polkinghorne talking about God gives the universe freedom to make itself.
Yes.
So then is the universe, or maybe I'm asking the wrong question, is the universe not geared for life if there's so much empty space?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, let me slightly nuance it by a question that some people ask me. Why did God create such a big universe? I mean, if he was simply interested in intelligent life, he would only need one star and one planet. Now, the obvious answer in response to that is that no one could do it Ph.Ds in astrophysics if that was the case. So God obviously created. More importantly, one of the things, and Aquinas, by the way, was very good at this, there is something about God, not just as the creator in the model of a scientist, but also God as the divine artist, the one who creates with extravagance. And for me, the vastness of the universe, with perhaps primitive life, but intelligent life being rare, is part of God's extravagance in creation. He loves creating. And sometimes God creates without it having to be important for human beings. Because part of this divine artist, so in Psalm 19, you get, the heavens declare the glory of God. Now, that's not about the glory of human beings. That's actually the heavens declaring the vastness, the awesomeness of God. There is something about the process by which the universe has come about, the wonderful process by which the universe has come about, where actually the possibility of life is written into the laws of physics.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no inevitability that the whole universe was created just for us. The universe was created by God, of which we are a gift of grace. We don't bring the universe into existence.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you say that. When our children were little, we have 4 adult children now, and when they were little, we had a book, and I don't know if we gave it away or what, but it was about, it told the story of God being an artist in creation, and it was a wonderful book. You know, God creates a daisy, and God liked the daisy, but as artists tend to do, God got carried away, and he created all kinds of daisies. And so there's this wonderful extravagance of creation. Go ahead.
And you get that, of course, in the first chapter of Genesis.
Yeah.
Now, if you go to many church services and someone's preaching on the first chapter of Genesis, what tends to happen is that the reader of the lesson or the scripture will read the first few verses and then the last few verses, first chapter of Genesis, partly because it's so long. And why it's so long is that the writer talks about how God created this kind and these kinds, and be fruitful and multiply. And there's this wonderful extravagance in the Creator God. And my favorite understatement of the Bible is verse 16 of Genesis 1, where it says, God created the greater light and the lesser light, the sun and the moon. And then the great understatement of the Bible, it says, he made the stars also. As if, by the way, God created 100 billion stars in 100 billion galaxies. That's the kind of extravagant God. He made the stars also.
Yeah, you talked about relationship too. One of the things that just every now and then when you're reading, so this, you're reading something or reflecting on something, and somebody says something that just clicks things in place. And I can remember years ago I was reading or listening. I don't remember if I was listening to Tom Wright, who does a lot of work, and Tom, who basically said that if God is Trinity, then creation through evolution is what you would expect.
Yes.
Because of relationship. Because God just isn't interested in having a momentary relationship with you, David, as an adult. Yeah. God was interested in being in relationship with you from the time of your birth and on. Same thing with creation. God wants to be in relationship with the creation as it develops. It makes perfect sense when you think about human relationships, right? I mean, the great joy of my relationship with my children today is that I've been able to relate to them for all those years and watch that relationship grow and develop. So, right. So evolution is just, you would just expect that an extravagant God who is inherently relational would create in that way.
And sometimes the science-religion dialogue has not paid enough attention to Trinitarian God. Often, when you read science-religion literature, we're stuck with a God of deism, a God who sets the universe off and then goes for a cup of tea. Yeah. A God who's talked about as a kind of impersonal, philosophical, scientific creator. But the model of the Trinity is so fruitful and needs to be brought in at every stage of this sense of how God creates.
Yeah, that's good. Excellent. So let's move into, because we have to have a conversation about Christian faith and Christian claims and extraterrestrial intelligence. There are those who have said that if tomorrow we absolutely can confirm that there are extraterrestrial aliens out there who are intelligent, far more advanced than we are, that the death knell of religion in general, of Christianity too, the death knell of religion is at hand. If we are not alone, what's your response to that?
I'd say no, and for a number of reasons. The first is that, as we've already talked about, Alan, there's a great deal of Christian thinking about this. So we shouldn't be afraid of it. I think, however, the conversation comes down to two major challenges to the Christian faith. The first is those who would say, you Christians would not understand or couldn't hold to your belief that human beings are special. Now, we've talked about that already, and I don't think that's a problem, because being made in the image of God is about relationship. It's not about status in the universe. The second is more interesting, and it's those who've said, if we discovered other intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, you Christians would have a problem with interpreting the Jesus event. And here, I think Christians have discussed and indeed disagreed with each other, certainly over the last 100 years. The significance of the Jesus event for Christians is that in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, God does two things for us. One is he reveals God's self to us by becoming human flesh. We know what God is like because we see God in Jesus. But then secondly, he offers us salvation through the work on the cross, forgiveness and a new start. And so there have been those who have said, well, this Jesus event is once for all for the whole universe. A distinguished Oxford physicist mathematician, E.A. Milne, a Roman Catholic, took this view and said, what happened on the cross at Calvary was once for all for the whole universe. I cannot imagine, he said, another Calvary elsewhere in the universe. And Mills said, therefore, the consequence is that you and I have to become cosmic missionaries, taking this good news of the one event to other life forms elsewhere in the universe. But that's a very long missionary journey, to say the least.
Yeah.
He was opposed by a number of other theologians, particularly E.L. Maskell in his Bampton lectures in the 1950s, who said, no, he said, the God that I see in Jesus would become incarnate on other worlds. So if there were a world of little green women and little green men, God would become incarnate as a little green incarnation, an alien Jesus. And the difficulty with that is that the particularity of the Christian claim. What I mean by that is that Christians claim that God became a particular man in a particular culture at a particular time in Palestine a very long time ago. So why, if God becomes incarnate in other worlds, why didn't God become incarnate in other cultures on the earth? Why didn't we have many Jesus figures? And so the question there is, does the incarnation, God becoming a human being, is that once for all, or is it lots in different places? And that's why Christians have disagreed, to be honest. Right. And there's no final answer to that at the moment.
That raises some interesting questions.
It raises some interesting questions. C.S. Lewis, great Christian writer and of both science fiction and of apologetics, have pointed out a very important thing, and that is that our understanding of the incarnation has this two parts to it. God showing us what he's like, but also God saving us. Lewis in his science fiction raised the question, if there was other intelligent life elsewhere, would they have fallen into sin in the same way that human beings have? And Lewis posed the question, it's not inevitable that that would happen with other intelligent life. So do you still need an incarnation if there's no fall into sin? Now what we're doing here, Allan, is stacking up some of the unknowns.
Yes.
To an extent where I'm happy to come to the point and say, as Polkinghorne and others have said over the years, well, I don't really know the case, but God would do what is necessary. The God that I see in Jesus gives me confidence that God would do what is necessary. And it may be that we have to wait for the visit of the flying saucer in order to find out how God has spoken to other cultures on other planets. Stanley Yaki, a Roman Catholic theologian, said, indeed, we Christians should be the first to greet alien visitors because, A, we're not going to greet them like politicians, but secondly, we're going to believe that there is some commonality because we believe in a God who created the whole universe. So I think there are challenges there, but I don't find they're threatening challenges to faith.
Well, that is a great segue to the last question I wanted to ask you, and that is that if so this coming week, if aliens in one of their ships set down there in Durham on the Palace Green, and they have a universal translator, just like in Star Trek, and you are one of the entourage to greet them and have conversation, what would you ask them?
What a great question. I think, first of all, as you well know, on Palace Green here in Durham, there's a 12th century cathedral which dominates the green. I might ask them, first of all, to come into the cathedral for some hospitality, so we can share some humanity with them, and also talk about this sense of worship. But the question I'd want to ask is, I think, have you experienced that which you would characterize as divinity? How have you experienced? Do you have that sense of awe which is so prevalent amongst people here on earth? Do you have that sense of justice which is so prevalent amongst people here on earth? Do you have stories which are similar to ours, about a man who lived and died and rose again, and demonstrated that there was more to this life than just fame and fortune and power? Do you have a sense of the divinity at work? Some sense of that which is both transcendent beyond you and immanent with you?
Yeah.
Let me hear the stories and your experience. And I think that's what I want to ask, Alan. That's more than just one question, I'm afraid.
No, that's all right.
But I think that's the kind of listening that Christians are called to do. Just in the same way, I would have to say that when I go into the cathedral coffee shop with my friends who are atheists, or my friends who are members of other faith communities, and those are similar questions to say, what do we share in common? Where do we differ? Let's find out about each other and talk more. Now, of course, we've skated over, and you rightly pointed in, the universal translator.
Yeah.
That's a very easy and quick fix in Star Trek.
Yeah.
But of course, if you've seen other science fiction movies like Arrival, you'll know just how difficult it may be to find communication and to understand each other. That may take quite a lot longer than the universal translator in Star Trek is able to do.
Wow. Yeah. Well, maybe you could find some things in common with mathematics, if that's the language of
I think
science.
that's certainly the case, and that's where I think mathematics, images, pictures, I think also this sense of a common experience of God actually would provide commonality between different cultures. They do so on Earth. There's no reason why they shouldn't also do that for any visitors from other planets.
Yeah.
That it doesn't have to be a particular set of words. There are other ways to communicate. And that's why when we've sent messages out with some of our probes, such as Voyager, we've sent music, we've sent pictures, we've sent images, we've sent equations, as well as text, because actually we know that we can communicate in lots of different ways.
Wow. Well, if that happens and you get to meet with them, I get the first interview after they do that. I would love it if you would be willing in a year or so to come back and talk about resurrection at Easter time.
Of course, I'd be delighted to.
I always get some pushback from friends of mine who are Christians but who have a science background and think resurrection is only metaphor. And
I'd be very happy to.
And I know that you think otherwise, so I would love to have conversation. All right.
Great.
Well, great. Thank you, David, for this, and I just appreciate the work you have done. Friends, I'm going to put links to David's information. Take a look at his books. Get on YouTube and do a search for his name, and there are conversations, lectures that will come up that he has done. So, and by the way, before you leave, hit that subscribe button. That gives us a little bit of exposure, and would appreciate that very much. Or if you're listening to a podcast, follow along. Appreciate that. Friends, this is Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Allan Bevere, and the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand." So, friends, keep seeking.